All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going really deep into something I think pretty important in biological anthropology. Biological anthropology, of course, is the study of human evolution and human variation.
Hmm.
And, we're specifically talking about human skeletal remains,
Yes.
curating them,
Yeah.
using them. What are the ethics of this, really? Because, our listeners are people who are interested in getting right to the heart of really complex topics, right? They want that rich, deep understanding quickly. So, we're going to try and deliver that for you today by looking at, not just kind of like the current state of things, but where did this come from, right? What's the history? What are the challenges? And most importantly, like, how are people thinking about moving this into a more respectful future?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's so fascinating is how the study of these remains, which is, physical remains, also intersect with history and also really, really deeply held values about how we treat the dead. And, in reading through these sources, what really stood out for me was just how much the past really was a place where these human skeletons, right, the remains of people, were really viewed as just scientific specimens. And that a lot of times the people who were being studied were the most vulnerable among us, and that their stories and the significance of who they were was just completely overlooked.
Yeah. And I think, for us, what we want to do today is kind of figure out, like, how did this happen?
Right.
What are the ethical dilemmas that this created? And, like, how do we move to ensure that there is a more just treatment of these individuals, but also they're living descendants? Because, this isn't just about the past. This is very much about the present. And, one of the things that is really, I think, driving this discussion, and it comes out in, many of the sources that we've read for this deep dive, is this growing awareness within kind of biological anthropology. And, the American Association of Biological Anthropologists, the AABA, is really playing a key role in recognizing, like, hey, we need to have, like, some updated guidelines for, like, how are we actually thinking about all of this stuff?
And there's also, I think, this real urgency that's kind of fueled by kind of events, specific events that have kind of compelled the discipline to really sort of take a harder look at what they're doing. And, the sources that we've read actually point to, this development of these new guidelines. It was prompted by discussions in their newsletter back in June 2021. And then, fast forward to 2022, at the AEBA Presidential Choice Symposium, it was like this was the central focus.
Right.
So clearly, yeah, this is something that has kind of bubbled up and is very much on people's minds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get into this a little bit. I mean, dehumanization, right? Like
Right.
how did, human remains, human skeletal remains become so kind of, I don't know. I mean, it's striking to me that they were so often kind of treated as like mere objects, right? Like ancient artifacts or something. Like there was no sense that these were individuals who had lives, who had connections.
And I think this is really important to kind of recognize that this objectification really impacted specific groups. The sources that we're looking at point to Indigenous people as well as African American communities as really bearing the brunt of this.
Yeah.
And that a lot of, the acquisition of these remains was actually, through, the violent processes of colonialism and then also through these deeply unethical practices like grave robbing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like it's disturbing to think that like no one even considered that like, hey, like maybe we should ask permission to dig up these burial sites and to like take the ancestors and like bring them to a lab. Like this was all done in the name of, research or whatever, but without any regard for cultural beliefs or,
Yeah.
like the grief that this would cause families. I mean, it's wild to me.
And I think what's really kind of notable now, though, is this movement led by Indigenous peoples worldwide. And it's gaining traction and it's powerful. And, the sources that we're looking at, just to give you some specific examples, Colwell 2015, Chechi 2024, Nash and Colwell 2020, Ruxtool et al. 2016, Mehana and Bradley 2018, like all of these, examples showcase this work that Indigenous people are doing to advocate for like legal protections, but also like a fundamental change in like how the whole issue is approached. So it's not like they're just victims in this history. They are actively shaping its future, which I think is really important.
Yeah, that's a really critical point. Like it's the narrative is changing and it's being driven by the very communities who were most affected by this. And, the paper that we're kind of focusing on today in this deep dive, I think really frames this well with like three kind of core questions. First, like how did these individuals like become reduced to just specimens, right? Like without any like historical consent. And then second, how do we develop ethical guidelines now, like in the present, that actually honor like their identities and address like all of the historical injustice, right? Like the colonialism, the structural inequality, the racism, like all of that stuff. And then third, like how do we even begin to engage with relatives and communities who may not even know that like their ancestors' remains are sitting in some institutional collection, right? Like how do you even start to like unravel that and deal with that?
Yeah. These are like such fundamental questions, that really go to like the heart of what are the responsibilities, of this discipline. And, I think as our sources indicate, like a lot of times these big shifts in how we think about things, they require some kind of catalyst. Like there has to be some event or something. And in the United States, the MOVE incident, I think, stands out as this really stark and painful example of a turning point like that.
Yeah, it's true. Like when you look at, the sources that we've got here, it's kind of highlighted that like a lot of times it's a major societal events or it's like allegations of like serious wrongdoing that really kind of force a field, whatever that field is, but in this case, biological anthropology, to kind of like really confront its own ethical failings. And you can think about, in the past, the passage of NAGI PRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that was huge. And, also all of the kind of debates that went on around Kennewick Man, also known as the Ancient One, like those were real moments that kind of spurred like, okay, we need to come up with some ethical frameworks to like figure out how we're going to do this in a way that is right.
And the MOV incident is just like it's almost unbelievable that this happened. It was in 2021, so it's really recent. And it was, of course, during this global health crisis and amidst this like really significant momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it just kind of brought all of these issues that we've been talking about that have existed for so long in biological anthropology, like right to the forefront. But maybe we could just kind of refresh our listeners' memory a little bit about what happened.
Yeah. So, the MOVE incident, this goes back to May 13th, 1985. So, this is something that happened, decades ago. But what happened was the Philadelphia Police Department, they dropped a bomb on the headquarters of MOVE. And MOVE is a Black liberation group. And tragically, the fire that resulted from this bombing killed 11 people. 5 of them were children, 6 of them were adults. And many other people were left homeless as a result of this. And, what's particularly disturbing is, in a very sort of like bizarre turn of events, the remains of 2 of these children, Delisha and Patricia Africa, became very central to like this whole kind of ethical breach.
And what's so kind of deeply troubling is how their remains were handled after this. Because, initially they were under the jurisdiction of the medical examiner's office.
Yeah.
And so anthropologists were like consulted for identification.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about Alan Mann and Janet Monge and then also Dr. Ali Hamley. And it seems like this is kind of where things went wrong, right?
Yeah. So Hamley, he actually did identify the remains as being, those of the children.
Yeah.
And it was based on like, their estimated age. But then Mann actually disputed this, saying that, the remains, they might have been from an adult. So because of this misidentification, this tragic misidentification, this actually delayed the family's ability to claim their children. So, just like adding even more anguish to this already like horrific event.
And then it just like kind of like deteriorated from there because eventually like the pelvic bone and leg bones of Delisha and Patricia, they ended up in a cardboard box at the Penn Museum for like quite some time. And then they were moved to Princeton with Mon and then eventually back to Penn. And throughout this, the family had no idea where these remains were.
It's unbelievable. Like, I mean, it really is. And then, fast forward to 2021, this is when it was discovered that these very remains were being used as a teaching tool in a Coursera online course called, Real Bones, Adventures in Forensic Anthropology. And this like public revelation, right, it really sparked a lot of outrage. And it was Maya Casuto, who's a reporter at Billy Penn, who really kind of brought all of this to light. So, for our listener, I think the key takeaway here isn't just about like these really tragic details. It's more about like, how did this event force like the field itself to really confront like some of these really uncomfortable truths?
It's almost unbelievable that like the tangible remains of children who were victims of such violence were being used for like educational purposes without the knowledge or consent of their family.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult to even wrap your mind around it. And even Carolyn Rouse, the anthropology department chair at Princeton, she even expressed like uncertainty about exactly which remains were in their possession.
Yeah, I mean, it really does kind of highlight like a complete like failure in maintaining like proper records and a clear like violation of established guidelines regarding, possession of human remains without, explicit consent from next of kin. And, as our sources point out, like this was literally discovered by chance. Africa Jr., who was one of the, children who survived the bombing, happened to see the online lecture, and that's how this all like came to light. Like it's unbelievable.
And this whole thing happening when it did, right? I mean, it was at this time
Yeah.
where there was all this heightened awareness about racial injustice, and it just really served as this like really stark reminder of the discipline's own historical connections to colonial practices and discriminatory attitudes. And, the sources really emphasize this point that like this wasn't just like an isolated error, right? It was really a symptom of this much more systemic issue of objectification and dehumanization within biological anthropology.
Totally. And, when we talk about like this history of dehumanization, we have to think about how like museums and institutions, they amassed these huge collections of remains. And these were basically taken from, Indigenous and African American graves, often, individuals who were formerly enslaved. And, we also know that like African American burial grounds, both, formal and informal, they've been routinely disturbed, relocated, or even erased. And this like contributes to, this really painful legacy and this early period, right, where there was just this complete lack of consent and this like dehumanization of certain groups. It kind of set this precedent that bled into how anthropology was done early on.
And this erasure isn't like a thing of the past. It's still happening. And the Association of Black Anthropologists, the Society of Black Archaeologists, the Black and Bioanthropology Collective, they've all called for like the creation of an African American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And, similar to the protections that are already in place for Native American remains under NEGPRA.
Yeah, and the scale of this is quite sobering. There are estimates that suggest that like at least 2,000 African American individuals' remains are currently held in various collections across the U.S. And, likely the actual number is much higher. And, one of the sources even mentions this, kind of disturbing example of Nat Turner, the leader of the 1831 rebellion. And his remains are actually believed to have entered the cadaver trade, so it's just like, wow.
I know it's just like, with the MVE case, I think it was really like this alarm bell. Like, okay, you really have to confront this and you have to address this like historical but also ongoing disrespect that has been shown to Black and brown people and their physical remains. And, a lot of the sources that we're looking at, like, Jones 2019, Cumber 2022, De La Cova et al. 2023, they all emphasize that like the first step has to be, like a full and honest acknowledgement of this really difficult history.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, to really kind of like wrap our heads around how these practices became so normalized, it's useful to take a step back and to look at like the early development of the anatomical sciences, right? Like, and the practice of human dissection. And, it's a history with some really kind of surprisingly troubling aspects.
Yeah. I mean, when you look back, our sources kind of trace, this early understanding of anatomy, to ancient Egypt and Vedic India, actually.
Wow.
And there was this surprisingly detailed knowledge of the human body, even then. And, the first documented instances of human dissection for, anatomical study were actually carried out by these guys, Herophilus and Erastratus, in Alexandria. This is in the 3rd century BC. But as the sources point out, like this was considered super taboo because of, the Greek beliefs of the time.
And unfortunately, like a lot of that early knowledge was lost. Like, when the Library of Alexandria burned down, like so much was lost there. And, for centuries, people who were interested in human anatomy, they were relying on like the study of animals and, particularly the work of, people like Aristotle and Galen. And, Galen, his work became like, one of the cornerstones of medical knowledge for a long time. But because he was relying on like animal anatomy, it led to some pretty significant inaccuracies when it was like applied to humans.
And what's kind of interesting is that for a really long time there was this period in the first millennium CE where human dissection was like prohibited, and this was both in the Islamic world and also by the Catholic Church. And Savage Smith actually writes about this in 1995, and it wasn't really until the second millennium when you started to see like the establishment of these European universities that you saw this renewed push for human dissection as like this basis for teaching and learning. So for centuries, really like direct like human anatomical knowledge, it was super limited.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it makes sense that, once dissection was like, kind of uh, allowed again, that there would be like this huge like push to use it. But unfortunately, a lot of the ways that it was used really disregarded, the rights and the dignity of certain individuals. And, our sources kind of detail, how a papal bull in 1299 permitted the dissection of individuals who had been executed for crimes. And then, the first documented like public dissection actually occurred in Bologna in 1315. And over time, dissection gradually became more accepted and it became more widespread. And, it was also driven in part by like, Renaissance artists who wanted to have this deeper understanding of human anatomy to like improve their work.
And the publication of Andreas Vesalius's work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, in 1555 was just huge. It was such a pivotal moment. Like his illustrations, they were so detailed and they were based on like his own human dissections. And this really corrected a lot of like the errors that Galen had that had persisted for so long. And it really kind of fueled this like desire for human dissection as like the basis of medical knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, as dissection became more common, it also understandably became a source of public fear and unease.
Yeah. I mean, Shakespeare even was aware of dissections going on in London. And, he even inscribed like a warning against grave robbing on his own epitaph. So, clearly this was something that was very much like on people's minds at the time. And as the demand for bodies, for anatomical study continued to rise, especially as, medical schools were proliferating, the legally available supply of bodies, it just couldn't keep pace.
And this really like fueled some terrible practices like grave robbing, for example, just became widespread. And, one of the sources talks about this really, really disturbing case of Burke and Hare, who were in Edinburgh. And these guys, I mean, it's unbelievable. They actually murdered 16 people in 1828 to supply the anatomist Robert Knox with cadavers.
That's insane. I mean, it's just like, just to think about like what people were willing to do to like get their hands on these bodies. And, this case, of course, led to like a huge public outcry. And it actually led to the passage of what's known as the Warburton Anatomy Act of 1832 in the UK. And while this legislation, was designed to kind of regulate the supply of bodies for dissection, what it really did was it created this new like vulnerable population, essentially, the unclaimed poor and marginalized individuals from workhouses. They became the main source of, bodies for anatomical study. And body snatching, this was still a huge problem well into the 19th century.
Yeah. And, the sources make this really interesting point, which is that, like, at the time, right, like medical professionals, they emphasize this need for objectivity and maybe even like a detachment in their work. But the reality is that, like, relying on bodies that were obtained without consent, laid this, like, fundamentally unethical foundation, for the fields of medicine. And, this is a point that Jones and Whitaker talk about in 2012 and also Skloot in 2010.
Yeah, I mean, and if we shift our attention now to the U.S., the sources kind of explain how various state legislatures, they passed these, anatomical acts that permitted the use of unclaimed bodies for dissection. But, the reality was that these laws disproportionately affected, marginalized communities, and they largely shielded the bodies of white individuals from being used in this way.
Yeah. And the sources actually kind of list who these unclaimed individuals often were. We're talking about enslaved and free, African Americans, immigrants, the poor, those who were deemed mentally ill. These were the people who became, the main sources for dissection and for the formation of these early anatomical collections. And, we see, in the historical records, we see documented instances of slave owners selling the bodies of deceased enslaved people. We see institutions just like directly donating the bodies of the poor and mentally ill. And we see this really horrifying practice of people going to graves and taking the bodies of immigrants and African Americans.
Yeah, and some of the university advertisements from that era are just like appalling. There's one that's cited from the South Carolina Medical College, and this was in the 1830s, and they just openly promised this ample supply of, quote, subjects, end quote, specifically from, quote, the colored population, end quote. I mean, it's just like so blatant, like, wow.
It's great. And then, over time, the focus really shifted, from from these individual physicians amassing their own collections to like these larger public institutions, museums, universities. They became the primary holders of these remains. And Walker, in 2000, he estimated that there were something like 700 U.S. institutions that held the remains of around 100,000 individuals. I mean, it's just like it's massive.
Yeah, it's a huge number. And, and all the while, the fear surrounding, grave robbers or, resurrectionists and, night doctors, this became kind of a tool to further oppress African American communities, particularly during the Great Migration. And there were all these rumors circulating, about these night doctors who were kidnapping and murdering, Black individuals, to take them to the North for dissection. And it just like created this really deep and totally understandable mistrust of the medical establishment. And, sadly, this is a legacy that continues to have repercussions today.
Yeah. I mean, I think like understanding the history of dehumanization in anatomy is actually really important for understanding why there's still so much mistrust between like marginalized communities and the scientific establishment today.
Yeah.
Like those things are linked.
Yeah, totally. Okay. So now we're at kind of like the end of the 18th century, and this is where anatomy and anthropology, they kind of converge. And, they kind of shared this interest in studying human skeletal variation. And this ultimately led to the birth of physical anthropology. But unfortunately, this new field kind of inherited many of the same Eurocentric and colonial biases that were, really prevalent at the time.
Yeah, I mean, early anthropology was very much practiced by physicians and anatomists, and they were the ones who had built these like vast collections of human remains, and a lot of these collections were obtained from burial sites, and they were then kind of tragically used to support and to perpetuate these like racist ideologies and to kind of justify discrimination and colonialism.
Yeah, and the sources actually identify some of like the key figures from this early period and their views, which are, obviously deeply problematic. Like you've got Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and his whole idea about degeneration from a supposed primordial type, and also how he elevated, people from the Caucasus Mountains. And then you've got Samuel George Morton and his practice of craniometry, which was all about like measuring skulls and using that to kind of justify like racial hierarchies. And and then we can't forget about like the case of Ishi, the Yakiana man who was essentially put on display in a California museum. So it's hard to believe that like this kind of stuff was commonplace, but it was.
Yeah, and it's not just figures from like the distant past. I mean, even like the founders of bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology, individuals like Ernest Houghton and Ala Shudlichka, they actively supported these so-called like racial sciences. And even Franz Boas, who a lot of people credit with opposing racial typology, he was deeply involved in what the sources call like skull wars with Hrdlička, and they were basically like competing to amass the largest collections of indigenous and non-European skeletons.
And the story of Minnick, the Inuit individual, who was brought to New York by Robert Peary at Bose's request. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. Like they staged this fake funeral for his father, Kasuk, and years later, Minnick discovers that like his father's actual remains were on display in the museum, and then Boas's attempts to like justify this are just really disturbing.
Yeah.
It's just like so awful. And this whole mindset of dehumanization, it had very real world consequences.
Yeah.
One of the most, I guess, horrific is the connection to the rise of the eugenics movement.
Yeah.
And it kind of starts with figures like Francis Galton and Carl Pearson, and it just like gained this huge amount of traction and acceptance across like the scientific establishment.
Yeah. And it's terrifying to see like how Nazi Germany actually used, research from American physical anthropology as like a scientific basis for their mass sterilization program, which started in 1933. And American anthropologists, they actually served on these like hereditary health courts that authorized the forced sterilization of hundreds of thousands of Germans, and the vast majority of these people, they were Jewish. And of course, this then tragically escalated to, the implementation of the blood protection law and ultimately the horrors of the final solution.
And, the involvement of Nazi German anatomists in these atrocities is just like chilling. Like they actually developed this whole like set of ethics, right, to justify euthanasia and genocide, and they routinely use the bodies of executed victims for dissection without any like recorded dissent or refusal, from within the anatomical community. It's really disturbing.
And our sources go into like a lot of detail about like the collaboration between German anatomists and the Nazi regime, and it just like they totally reorganized academic institutions to align with Nazi ideology. They were conducting all of these like horrific experiments on prisoners, and the executions were actually timed to serve as part of their research protocols. And what's even more disturbing is that like a lot of this work it actually entered like the established anatomical canon. So like certain structures and procedures, they still bear the names of these individuals, and their textbooks continue to be used, and some of them actually even contain like photographic evidence of Holocaust victims' bodies.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because all of this was going on, but at the same time there were these really important developments happening in evolutionary biology.
Yep.
So you had figures like Julian Huxley, Theodosis Dobzhansky, G.G. Simpson. They were developing what's known as the modern synthesis, and this really fundamentally shifted like the understanding of species, and it laid the groundwork for rejecting racial science in favor of an evolutionary approach to understanding human populations. And this is sometimes referred to as new physical anthropology.
Yeah, but as the sources point out, there's like this tragic irony because this population-based approach actually inadvertently encouraged the continued collection of human skeletal remains. It was just under a different like scientific rationale, And so today we have, estimates suggesting that there are over 500,000 individuals held in anatomical collections across the U.S., and a disproportionate number of these are the remains of indigenous ancestors.
Yeah. And, Marie Darlene Pearson, she was just such a powerful activist, and she was really responding to, this discriminatory treatment of Native American remains in Ohio. And this was in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And her work actually led to some really significant state level legislation, and ultimately to the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NEDGPRA, in 1990. And it was a landmark piece of legislation.
Yeah, and NGPR, I mean, it's really important, but it's also kind of spurred like these similar movements, and these demands for justice among indigenous communities, worldwide, and they're rightfully seeking the return and respectful treatment of their ancestors' remains. And if there's like one message that comes out of all of the sources that we're looking at, it's that like anthropologists, they really need to transform their relationship with deceased individuals, and to put like a huge emphasis on obtaining informed consent and really prioritizing the needs and the perspectives of living descendant communities. Yeah.
And sadly, even today, like unethical practices, in how human remains are acquired, for anatomy education, it's still a thing. And while some institutions they really try to like prioritize ethical sourcing, through these established body donation programs, a lot of institutions still rely on this for-profit body broker industry, and it's largely unregulated, and it's often really opaque. You don't really know what's going on.
Yeah. And, this body broker market in the U.S., the only real exceptions are organs intended for transplant and fetal tissue. But, aside from those, it operates with very little, government oversight. It's really kind of shocking. And the sources, kind of describe how these brokers, a lot of times they incentivize donation with the promise of free cremation services. So, it's almost like putting like a monetary value on the donation of one's body after death.
It's crazy, and the reporting that Reuters did, which is mentioned in some of the sources, it just paints this like really disturbing picture of this.